We're going to jump right into one of the more important concepts that we'll cover in this class, the time value of money. It's not really that difficult, to be honest, but it is absolutely essential, and that's why if you're taking any finance course at some other university or even in high school, this is probably one of the first things that you're going to cover. Basically, what we're doing in this chapter is thinking about how we can grow our money over time based on interest rates, based on how much money we're starting with, and based on how long we have to invest. Or alternatively, with the time value of money, we can think about how much borrowing is going to cost us. You know, if I want to borrow $200,000 to buy a house today, how much is that going to cost me 20 years from now, for example? Okay, so that's the principle of the time value of money. In the book, freefinancebook.com, you should definitely check it out. I go into much greater detail on these concepts. What I'm doing in these videos is just trying to give you the main ideas. So this formula here, which I'm not going to derive, but I am going to explain, is the principal formula that we use most of the time in these examples. What we're solving for is the left-hand side, the future value. So if we invest money today, how much are we going to have in the future? And the amount that we're going to have in the future is based on how much we start with, the present value. I, the interest rate, that would be the annual return we're getting on that investment. And N, which is the number of years. So for example, I might invest $1,000 at 2% interest for 40 years. And maybe that's the kind of return I could generate in, like a savings account, a really safe investment. And so if I plug in the variables using that formula that we just had, I would find that over 40 years, I could grow that $1,000 to $2,208.04. And you should be able to do this calculation by whatever means you want. Calculator, Excel, whatever. There's even places you can do this online where you just throw in the values and it just spits it out for you. Shouldn't be hard to do. I just want you to recognize, though, how sensitive future value is to changes in the parameters, particularly changes in I and N, the interest rate and the time period. So for example, let's say instead of putting $1,000 into maybe a savings account, let's put it into stocks. And if we invest in stocks, there's no guarantee about what return we're going to generate. But if we look at historical average returns of U.S. stocks, we can estimate about a 10% return would be our best guess. Could be a little higher, could be a little lower. There's going to be good years, there's going to be bad years. But over a really long period of time, like 40 years, that's probably the best guess because that's what's happened in the past. So if we invest in the stock market and generate a 10% return, nothing changes in our formula except for the interest rate. So now instead of getting 2%, we get 10%. And over 40 years, we might expect to grow our money to a little over $45,000. And I would think you've probably seen these types of calculations before, but if not, it should be pretty mind-blowing. You got to get your money invested in a way where it has a real chance to grow. Okay, so I run into students a lot of the time. They'll tell me things like, oh, I've been working in the summer. I've got $18,000 in a checking account. And they're afraid to put money in stocks, or they don't know how to put money in stocks. My view on that is you really probably should be aggressive when you're young. When you're young, you can take on risk. When you're young, you got a lot of left, a lot of years left for that money to grow. So when we're talking about long periods of time, little changes in those interest rates are so important that I try to keep as much of my money invested in the stock market as I can within reason. And we'll learn a lot more about that as we go through this course. Now, some of you who've seen this before might be recognizing that I'm making a really important assumption here about how this interest is compounding over different periods of time. So let's rethink how this formula might be shaped. If I use my formula here that we started with, what I am assuming about interest is that it compounds annually. Annual compounding interest is often a good way to think about money growing over long periods of time, especially when it comes to something like stock market investing. because stock market investing doesn't really follow any rules. It's not like somebody's going into your account and adding money. It's very, very irregular how that growth will occur. So annual compounding interest works pretty well. Let me explain what that is, okay? Annual compounding interest, this is what it looks like. If you invest $1,000 on, let's say, January 1st, then 1 year from now, so this is year one, let's say, 1 year from now, in year two, if you've been earning 10% interest, you would have $1,100 in your account. During this year, the interest has not compounded. What that means is the interest has not grown on top of the interest. Whoever has been setting up this account is not considering your interest when deciding how much interest to put into your account, okay? I think this will make more sense once we go one more year into the future. Now, when we hit this point right here, 1 year with annual compounding interest, we will restart the interest clock. So during the first year, the $1,000 that you invested will be the determinant of how your money will grow during that first year. But after 1 year is up, the people running your account will look at it and say, okay, this person has $1,100. Now that $100 that you've earned in interest will start to earn its own interest. So now during this next year, they will use $1,100 as the basis for determining how your money is going to grow into the future. And what we would see is 2 years into the future, you'd have $1,210, okay? That $10 extra right there is the interest that came from that $100 in interest. Again, if this doesn't make sense, go check out the book, freefinancebook.com. It's totally free. Go take a look. I explain it there in much greater detail. Now, interest doesn't always grow like this. In fact, it typically doesn't. Instead, it follows other types of rules. So, for example, if you invest in a savings account, you usually will get monthly compounding interest. And without dealing with any of the numbers here, let me just explain how this would work. If you put $1,000 into a savings account, because bank accounts and bank statements are usually monthly, they use monthly compounding interest. That means after the first month you invest, they will immediately start to reset the clock on your compounding interest. So after 1 month, they reset the clock and they start solving for compounding interest. 2 months into the future, they do it again. So in monthly increments, you get compounding interest. The more times interest compounds, the more growth you'll get. So for that reason, credit card companies who are trying to get as much money out of their spenders as they possibly can will use very frequent compounding periods, usually 365 times a year or 360 times a year. And let me show you what this looks like. To solve for compounding interest using different periods just means we have to apply a small change to our formula. So this is just for annualized. Good starting place. This is the formula we need for any other period of time. So really similar formula there. Really similar formula there, just one change, and that is T. So we already know the other variables. Present value is the amount you start with. I is the interest rate. N is the number of years. T is the number of time periods in a year. So for example, if you have a savings account, it will have monthly compounding interest. That means T would be 12, okay? Now these formulas here will work. This formula, in fact, is the only one you actually need to memorize because they are the same. If we use annual compounding interest, then that means T would be 1. That means interest compounds once per year. So if this is 1, we can effectively just take it out of the formula. It's not doing anything for us, okay? So this is technically the only formula that you need. Now from this formula, we can see the impact of different compounding periods. So for example, let's say that you borrow $10,000. It's kind of a silly example, but let's say you borrow $10,000 for 20 years. 20% interest rate, 20 years, and T equals 1. That means interest compounds just once per year. We can see how much you would owe 20 years into the future. All we need to do is replace the variables in our formula. And yeah, obviously I didn't need to write the T's there. They're not doing anything for me, right? But I just included them anyway. So what you would get after you do some calculations there is this leads to about $383,000 in debt. So if you borrow $10,000 at a 20% interest rate for 20 years with one compounding period per year, this is how much you would owe after 20 years. Now, credit card companies are just like any other firm. They're in the marketing game. They're trying to make things look cheap when it's in their advantage to make it look cheap, and one of those things is interest rates. Okay? Most people don't understand annual compounding period. So if you decide you're going to do T of 365 daily compounding interest, most people who are using a credit card don't know what that means. So the credit cards are going to do that. So let's say we change nothing about our calculation except we now have daily compounding interest. That means that the compounding nature is recalculated every day. So at 8 a.m., they restart the compounding clock every single day. That's going to speed things up, okay? And if we use our formula here, changing nothing in the formula except now we're using daily compounding interest, 365 times a year. What you would get is that you would owe $545,000 and about $384. And you can see how large those differences are. Financial literacy, understanding finances, understanding really the basics is really important just to avoid ridiculously dumb mistakes like this. So if you have two options to borrow, you would want to look at the compounding periods to determine which is better. Okay? Now these formulas here allow us to do more than just solve for the future value. I'm not going to derive any of these here, but it is in the book. But we can take these formulas and let's just deal with the annual one for now. All right. Using that formula there, we can solve for any of the other formula or any of the other variables. And there'd be lots of compelling reasons why we would want to solve for those. The most obvious would be to solve for present value, which would look like this. This is a formula that I find myself calculating pretty often. Okay, here's my thought process. When I'm 52 years old, I plan to retire. And when I'm 52 years old, I need to have $2.5 million to retire. $2.5 million is my future value. There's an interest rate that I can imagine I'll expect to earn. And I can look into the future and say, how many years do I have until I get to age 52? From that, I can solve for the present value. This shows me how much money I need today to accomplish my goals in the future. I can also solve for I or for N. This is laid out clearly in the book. Solving for the interest rate is valuable because you might ask yourself, what interest rate do I need to earn to achieve my goals, whatever those goals may be? Or N, maybe I need to have $1.5 million to retire, or maybe I need to have $20,000 to go buy a car. Well, I need to see how long it will take to reach that goal. I might say to myself, I've got $12,000 invested today. How many years will it take before I get to $20,000 and I can buy that vehicle? So there's various reasons why you would want to use these formulas, and it's very practical, and it's really quite simple. So I would encourage you to check out freefinancebook.com. This is chapter 2, the time value of money. There's examples laid out. There's practice problems. There's everything you need to gain skill in this so that you can avoid bad financial mistakes.